Hello everyone, this is a step-by-step video on how to replace the V-belt on first light. For those watching it before the fact, there is more information at the end of the video, but for those that need it on the fly, we'll jump straight into it. The first step is to make sure that the boat is safe and not in immediate danger from rocks and other obstacles for at least 15 minutes. If the boat is in any danger, now would be the time to deploy the anchor. If you are quick and you keep an eye on the temperature gauge, you might have time to drive the boat away from any danger before it overheats. The usual running temperature of the engine is 65 degrees. Anything over 90 degrees and the engine will be losing coolant, so at this temperature you are definitely on borrowed time. Turn the engine off using the stop switch on the dash. Also turn off battery switch marked start. This is located behind you at about knee level if you are in the steering position. Step 2 is to contain the diver. If you are able to grab their line using either the boat hook or a rope with a weight on the end, do so. Pull in any slack of their line before tugging on it at least 5 times to signal to them that there is a problem and for them to come up as soon as possible. Doing this, you risk the possibility that the diver will separate from the line, but this is a decision that will need to be made depending on the situation at the time. Step 3 is to call for help and quickly explain the situation. If you're on the East Coast, my preference would be to call VTS on Channel 12. For everywhere else, call Guernsey Coast Guard on Channel 16. With a diver in the water, you are technically a mayday, but at this point I would advise the VTS or Coast Guard that you have broken down with a diver in the water and that the situation should be fixable within approximately 5 minutes. Any other boats in the area can also be called for assistance at this time. Remember that this is an ongoing issue and you will need to keep an eye on both the boat and the diver while listening to the VHF for any contact from VTS or Coast Guard while you attempt the fix. You will need a 13mm spanner, something to cut cable ties, and at least 3 cable ties or some string. As you look at the front of the engine, you will see 3 pulleys. The bottom one is the drive pulley on the crankshaft, the pulley on the left is the freshwater pump for the engine coolant, and the one on the right is for the alternator. Using a 13mm spanner or socket, loosen off the bolt for the alternator slider. A turn or 2 should be enough. Next, look for the nut on the alternator pivot. This is on the back side, obscured by wiring but easy enough to get to with the spanner. Loosen this one too. If the whole bolt turns, you will need to hold the bolt with another 13mm spanner or a socket. 1/2 inch will also work at a push. You should now be able to lift the alternator and remove the old belt. You may have to cut it off if it has wrapped itself around anything. If you cannot get enough slack, remove the slider bolt completely. It goes bolt, washer, slider, washer, alternator. Try not to drop any of these in the bilge. They can be a little bit fiddly to get back into place. Next, take a new belt from where they are stored. You will need to cut the cable ties holding them in place. Pay attention to how the belts are fixed, as you will need to lash them back with either cable ties or string once you have finished. The belt size needed is a 41. There are other belts in the cluster for the deck wash and they are smaller. Take the new belt and place it in the lower pulley before going around the water pump pulley and then finally pulling over the alternator pulley. You can also try going around the alternator before the water pump and then pulling from the other side of the engine hatch whilst turning the water pump pulley by hand if this helps. If you still can't get the belt on, try removing the alternator slider bolt as mentioned previously if you haven't already done so. Once the belt is in place, push down on the alternator to tighten the belt and do up the slider bolt while keeping the pressure on the alternator. You can then gently check the belt tension and readjust if needed. You should be able to deflect the belt around 1/2 inch with about 50% of the force you could achieve if you really tried. Then tighten the lower alternator pivot bolt. Then make sure all the spare belts are secure and away from the shaft. Restart the engine and check that everything is working okay. You should keep the revs low until the engine is cooled back to around 65 degrees if at all possible. If lots of coolant was lost, you may need to top this up at the heat exchanger. Make sure to use a big towel or similar to undo the radiator cap, as there is likely to be a lot of pressure and steam in there. Once the boat is running again, you can release the diver and call VTS or the Coast Guard and stand them down. The V-belt on first light runs the freshwater coolant pump and the alternator. You will know that it has gone immediately with the audible alarm as the alternator stops running and charging, and slightly after this as the engine overheats. Visually, there will be a charge light on the dashboard along with the engine temperature gauge and voltage gauge. For those with more time on the boat, you may even hear the belt go with a strange noise as it slaps around the engine bay and the engine tone changes. Thanks for watching. Let's go diving.